I stood in the doorway, unable to move. The woman was somewhere inside the darkness. "Emma," I said. There was a long silence, and then she stepped into the light. She looked older than she had in the photographs, of course, but there was no mistaking her. She had the same green eyes as mine, the same shape of nose, and the same small scar above her eyebrow that my mother had once told me I had inherited from my father. She looked at me for several seconds, then smiled and said, "You look exactly like him." My voice barely worked. "My father?" I asked. She nodded and said, "He always said you'd come back eventually." I stared at her. "Come back? I've never been here." Emma looked around the underground room and quietly replied, "Not physically." Then she pointed toward a table. On it were dozens of photographs showing my childhood, my first day of school, my graduation, my wedding, my divorce, Lily being born, and almost every important moment of my life. I felt sick and asked, "Who took these?" Emma looked away and said, "Richard." I immediately asked, "Richard Vale?" She nodded and said, "He wasn't watching you because he wanted to hurt you. He was protecting you." I shook my head and asked, "Protecting me from what?" Emma walked toward an old metal cabinet and opened it. Inside were hundreds of files. She pulled out one folder with my name written across the front and handed it to me. Inside were my birth certificate, school records, medical records, photographs, and everything else connected to my life. But beneath those documents was something else, a legal agreement signed by my father 25 years earlier. I read it slowly. My father had placed me into a private protection program after the fire. It wasn't an official government program. He had discovered that the fire at Briar Lane wasn't an accident, and that someone had deliberately started it. The target wasn't Emma. It was my father. Emma had survived because he had hidden her before the fire. But after the fire, he believed the people responsible would come back, so he separated us. Emma was sent to live under another identity, while I was raised believing I was an only child. My father spent the rest of his life collecting evidence, and Richard Vale helped him. I looked at Emma and asked, "Then why did Richard die?" She stared at the floor and said, "He didn't." My heart stopped. "What?" I asked. "Richard disappeared," she said. "The death certificate was fake. He created it because the people who were looking for us finally found him." Suddenly I understood the black sedan, the photographs, the cameras, and the messages. Someone wasn't trying to scare me away. They were trying to find Emma, and they had used me to locate her. I looked at the files again and asked, "Why did they let me buy this house?" Emma's expression changed. "They didn't." I frowned and said, "What do you mean?" She pointed toward the legal documents and said, "The house was never supposed to be sold to you." I frowned. "The real estate agent," Emma interrupted, "was working for them." The room seemed to spin. She continued, "They deliberately lowered the price. They knew you'd buy it." I asked, "Why?" Emma took a deep breath and said, "Because your father left something behind." I looked around the room and asked, "The photographs?" She shook her head. "No," I asked. "The evidence?" She answered, "No." I looked at her and asked, "Then what?" Emma walked toward the far wall and pressed her palm against a section of concrete. A hidden panel opened, revealing a small steel box. She removed it and placed it on the table. Inside was a single cassette tape and a handwritten note. The handwriting was my father's. I knew it immediately. The note contained one sentence: "If Daniel finds this, tell him the truth before they find Emma." My hands were shaking as I placed the cassette into an old player. Static filled the room, and then I heard my father's voice, older and tired, but unmistakably his. "Daniel." I closed my eyes. "If you're hearing this, I failed to protect you from the truth." The recording continued. "I spent years investigating the people responsible for the Briar Lane fire. They weren't after money. They weren't after property. They were trying to destroy evidence." My father's voice paused before continuing. "The fire was designed to destroy records, proving that several powerful people had been illegally purchasing abandoned properties through false identities." I looked at Emma, and she nodded. My father continued, "Richard discovered the same thing. That's why he built the surveillance room. He wasn't spying on the neighborhood for himself. He was documenting everyone connected to the operation." Then came the sentence that changed everything. "Daniel, one of the people involved is someone you know." The recording stopped. I stared at the machine and asked, "That's it?" Emma shook her head and said, "There's another tape." She reached beneath the table and pulled out a second cassette. My father's voice returned. "There's only one person who has been able to keep this operation alive. The man who controls the property records." The man who has access to every deed, every identity, every investigation. I felt a chill. Then my father said his name. Richard Vale. I looked at Emma, and she immediately shook her head. No, I said. That can't be right. The tape continued. Richard isn't the mastermind. He's been pretending to be one of them. He's been inside the organization for 25 years. He's been protecting Emma and Daniel, but eventually, they'll discover his betrayal. The recording ended. Suddenly, everything made sense. Richard hadn't been watching me. He had been watching the people watching me. The cameras weren't there to trap me. They were there to identify anyone who came near the house. The black sedan wasn't Richard's enemy. It belonged to the people searching for Emma. And the man in the car hadn't been pointing at my house. He had been pointing at the hidden camera on the second floor. I looked at Emma and asked, "Where is Richard now?" She hesitated and said, "He's alive." I asked, "Where?" Before she could answer, the lights went out. Complete darkness filled the room. Then came the sound of the steel door locking behind us. Emma grabbed my arm and whispered, "They found us." Footsteps echoed from the other side, one and then another. A voice came through the door. "Emma," she froze. The voice continued, "Come outside. You don't need to hide anymore." I recognized it. Detective Mason, the detective who had supposedly been helping me. I leaned toward Emma and whispered, "He's one of them." She nodded and said, "He always was." The door began to unlock. We had seconds. Emma pointed toward a narrow tunnel behind the shelves and said, "Go." I asked, "What about you?" she shouted. "Go!" We ran. The tunnel was barely wide enough for one person, and behind us, the steel door crashed open as someone shouted, "Find them!" We kept running until the tunnel eventually opened, behind an abandoned warehouse, nearly half a mile from my house. When we emerged, Richard Vale was waiting. He was older than I remembered from the photographs, but he was alive, holding a flashlight. He looked at Emma, then at me, and smiled. "I'm sorry," he said. I stared at him and asked, "For what?" He answered, "For making you believe your whole life was a lie." He looked toward the darkness behind us and continued, "It wasn't your father spent his life protecting you. Emma spent hers protecting you, and I've spent mine making sure both of you survived long enough to learn why." Suddenly, police sirens filled the night, but this time, they weren't coming for us. State investigators had already been given the evidence. Detective Mason was arrested before he could leave the property, and the real estate agent was arrested 2 days later. Then came the larger investigation. Bank records, false identities, illegal property transfers, and forged documents began exposing the truth. The operation had been running for more than 25 years, and the house on Briar Lane had been at the center of it. The surveillance room wasn't a prison. It was an archive, a record of everyone involved, every meeting, every transaction, and every person who had disappeared. The photographs weren't the treasure, they were the evidence. Months later, the entire network collapsed. Richard testified, Emma testified, and eventually, so did I. The house was no longer worth $500,000. It was worth far more, not because of its land, but because of what had happened there. The government seized it as evidence, but before I left for the final time, I walked through the upstairs hallway. The hidden door had been removed, the walls were repaired, and the strange room was empty. For the first time, the house felt ordinary. Emma stood beside me and asked, "You still want to sell it?" I smiled and said, "No." She looked surprised and asked, "Why?" I looked toward the backyard, because despite everything, it was the first place where I had finally discovered who my family really was. I had bought the house believing I was starting a new life. Instead, I had walked directly into the life my father had spent decades trying to protect me from. The house hadn't been haunted. It had been watching, waiting, recording, and protecting a secret until someone finally came looking for it. And that someone was me. Sometimes the darkest secrets aren't buried because people want them forgotten. They're buried because someone is waiting for the right person to uncover them. And sometimes, the house you thought you bought by accident was the house that had been waiting for you all along. The first week in the house was surprisingly peaceful. Lily loved the backyard, especially the old wooden swing hanging beneath the large oak tree, and she spent hours outside while I worked through the house room by room. The kitchen needed new cabinets, the living room needed paint, and the upstairs hallway had several damaged electrical outlets that I decided to repair myself. Nothing seemed unusual until I removed one of those outlets, and noticed that the wiring behind it looked much newer than everything surrounding it. I pulled the outlet completely out of the wall and shined my flashlight into the cavity, expecting to find nothing more than old wiring, but instead I saw a wooden frame, and behind that frame was a narrow door. I stared at it for several seconds. The door was almost invisible because someone had painted over it several times, and there wasn't even a handle, only a tiny metal latch. I immediately checked the house blueprint because the hallway should have ended at the bedroom wall, and according to the plans, there was no room behind it. I checked the measurements again, then checked the blueprint one more time, but nothing explained what I was looking at. I called the contractor who had inspected the house before I bought it, and when I told him about the hidden door, he said he had never seen it. I asked if it could simply be some old storage space, and he said maybe, but then his voice became more serious. "Daniel, if that room isn't on the blueprint, don't start cutting into the wall until you know what you're dealing with." I should have listened to him, but curiosity had already taken over. The next morning, I removed the panel around the doorway, and behind it I found a narrow passage that was only about 4 feet wide. The air smelled old and dry, and every sound seemed strangely amplified as I moved forward with my flashlight. The passage ended at another door, and this one had a deadbolt. I stood there for a moment, wondering why someone would build a hidden passage inside a suburban house, and then secure the end of it with a deadbolt. Finally, I opened the door, and that's when I found the photographs. The room was small, maybe 12 feet by 15 feet, and there was almost no furniture, except for an old wooden desk, several shelves, and a wooden chair. But the walls were covered with photographs, hundreds of them, some black and white, and others faded with age. At first, I couldn't understand what I was looking at. There were photographs of houses, people, cars, children, and ordinary moments from everyday life. I thought Richard Vale might have been some strange amateur photographer who had spent decades documenting the neighborhood, but then I recognized the street. It was Briar Lane. One photograph showed my house, but it looked different from the way it looked now. The trees were smaller, the fence was new, and the entire property looked as though it had been photographed decades earlier. I picked up another photograph and saw the same house from a different angle. Then I found another showing the same street, followed by one of my neighbor's house, and another showing the woman who lived across the street walking her dog. There were photographs of people getting into cars, leaving their homes, returning from work, and going about their ordinary lives. As I stood there looking at them, I slowly realized that Richard hadn't been photographing houses. He had been watching people. I turned toward the old desk and noticed several notebooks stacked beneath it. I opened the first one and found names, dates, addresses, and descriptions written in neat handwriting. Some entries recorded when people left their homes, when they returned, when their children were picked up from school, and how long visitors stayed. My stomach tightened as I read through them, because this wasn't photography. It was surveillance. Someone had been monitoring the neighborhood for years, recording the routines of ordinary people and documenting their movements, as though they were subjects in some long-running investigation. I picked up another notebook and noticed that the handwriting had changed. The dates were different, the ink was different, but the same names appeared repeatedly. Then I noticed one name that I knew better than any other, my own, Daniel Carter. I dropped the notebook, and for several seconds, I couldn't move. I tried to convince myself there had to be another explanation, maybe another Daniel Carter, maybe some coincidence, but when I picked up the notebook again, the entry clearly contained my name, and underneath it was my date of birth. I felt cold. I turned the page and found more entries about me, including my school, my first apartment, my old workplace, the places where I had lived, and even people I had dated. These weren't things a stranger could have guessed. Then I found the photographs. One showed me at 17, another showed me at 22, and another showed me standing outside my first apartment. The newest photograph showed me at 34, and it had been taken only months before I bought the house. Someone had been following me. I ran downstairs and found Lily sitting at the kitchen table eating cereal. She looked up and asked, "Dad?" I stared at her for a moment before telling her, "Pack a bag." She looked confused and asked, "Why?" I said, "We're leaving." She asked, "Where?" And I answered, "Anywhere." She gave me a nervous smile and asked, "Are we going on vacation?" I couldn't answer her, because at that exact moment, I heard the upstairs floor creak. Someone was walking inside the house. Lily looked toward the hallway and quietly said, "Dad, I immediately put my finger against my lips, and we both went silent. Another step sounded above us, followed by another, slowly moving toward the staircase. I grabbed the fireplace poker and waited, listening for whoever was upstairs. The footsteps suddenly stopped, and for several seconds there was nothing but silence. Then my phone vibrated. An unknown number had sent me a message. "You weren't supposed to find that room." I stared at the screen, and before I could react, a second message appeared. "And you should never have brought your daughter here." I immediately called the police, but before I could explain everything, another message appeared. This one contained a photograph. I opened it, and my blood ran cold because it was Lily, sitting at the kitchen table exactly where she was standing at that moment. The photograph had been taken from somewhere inside my house less than 1 minute earlier. I looked toward the windows, but there was nobody outside. I checked the doors, and they were locked. Then I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A tiny black camera hidden inside the smoke detector above the kitchen. I tore it from the ceiling, and when I touched it, I realized the battery was still warm. Someone was watching us. Right now. I grabbed Lily's hand and ran outside, but when I reached the driveway, I stopped. Across the street, a black sedan was parked beneath the trees. The driver's window slowly lowered, and an older man looked directly at me. Then he raised one hand, not waving, but pointing at my house. A moment later, he drove away. I memorized the license plate because by then I knew one thing for certain. Whatever had been hidden inside that house wasn't just history, and whoever had been watching the neighborhood for all those years had not stopped watching me. That night, I stayed at a hotel with Lily, but I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the photograph of her sitting at our kitchen table, taken from somewhere inside the house, and I kept thinking about the tiny camera I had pulled from the smoke detector. Whoever had installed it hadn't just been watching the house. They had been watching us in real time. Around 3 in the morning, my phone rang. The caller was Detective Mason, the officer who had responded after I reported the messages. He told me they had checked the license plate of the black sedan, and when he gave me the name connected to it, I almost dropped the phone. The vehicle was registered to Richard Vale, the previous owner of my house, the same man everyone had told me was dead. I stared at the wall for several seconds before saying, "That's impossible." Detective Mason paused and then replied, "That's what I thought." He explained that Richard Vale's death certificate had been filed 4 years earlier, and according to the official records, he had died inside the Briar Lane property. I told Mason about the photograph I had taken of the man in the sedan, and he became quiet again before saying, "Daniel, Richard Vale's death certificate was filed 4 years ago, but the photograph you showed me was taken yesterday." I didn't know what to say. I had purchased the house because I believed its previous owner was dead, yet I had just watched the supposedly dead man sitting across the street and staring directly at me. The next morning, Detective Mason arrived at the house with 2 officers, and we searched every room from top to bottom. I took them upstairs and showed them the hidden passage, but when we opened the concealed room, I felt the blood drain from my face. It was empty. Every photograph was gone, every notebook had disappeared, every camera had been removed, and even the old wooden desk was missing. Someone had cleared the entire room overnight, and they had done it so carefully that there was almost no evidence left behind. I stood in the middle of that empty space while the officers searched the walls, and for a moment, I wondered if I had imagined everything. Then Detective Mason called me over and pointed toward the floor beneath where the desk had been. A single photograph had been left behind. I picked it up, and the moment I saw it, I knew this wasn't over. The photograph showed my father standing outside the Briar Lane house when he was much younger, and beside him stood Richard Vale. But that wasn't what made my hands shake. Between them was a little girl. She was maybe 8 years old, and there was something strangely familiar about her face, even though I had never seen her before. Detective Mason looked at the photograph, and then looked at me before asking, "Daniel, do you know who that is?" I shook my head and said, "No." He turned the photograph over, and written across the back were 4 words that made everything inside me go cold. "She survived the fire." My father had never told me about any fire. I took the photograph home and spent the entire afternoon searching through every box of his belongings that my mother had kept after his death. I went through old photographs, tax records, letters, bank statements, and anything else that might explain what I was looking at, but nothing made sense. Then, at the bottom of an old closet, Beneath several boxes filled with my father's clothes, I found a locked metal case. I had never seen it before. I forced it open, and inside was a newspaper clipping from 1999. The headline read, "Local house fire claims 2 lives." I read the article twice, then a third time, because the address printed beneath the headline was Briar Lane. It was my house. According to the article, a woman and her 8-year-old daughter had died in a fire at the property. I kept reading until I reached the girl's name, and that's when my entire body went numb. Her name was Emma Carter, my last name. I sat down on the floor and stared at those words, because Emma Carter wasn't a stranger. She was my sister, the sister I had never known existed. I had spent my entire life believing I was an only child, and my father had never once mentioned having a daughter named Emma. I couldn't understand how an entire person could be erased from a family history, but the more I thought about the hidden room, the surveillance photographs, and the message on the back of that photograph, the more I realized that my childhood had been built around secrets. I called my mother. She didn't answer. I called again, and still nothing. Almost an hour later, she finally returned my call, and I asked her one question. Who was Emma? There was silence on the other end, followed by the sound of my mother crying. Finally, she whispered, "Your father told me she died." I felt my stomach drop and asked, "What do you mean?" She said, "He said the fire killed her." I asked, "Was she really my sister?" There was another long silence, and then she quietly said, "Yes." I closed my eyes and asked why nobody had ever told me. My mother hesitated before saying something that made even less sense. She told me my father had said someone was looking for Emma, and when I asked who, she said she didn't know. Then she began crying again and whispered, "Your father told me never to go back to Briar Lane." I looked through the window toward the house, and suddenly I understood why the price had been so low. This wasn't a haunted house, and it hadn't been abandoned simply because someone died there. Someone had spent 25 years making sure nobody looked closely enough to discover what had really happened. I had thought I was buying a quiet home for Lily, but I had unknowingly purchased the exact place where my family had buried its darkest secret. The more I thought about it, the more one question kept returning to me. If Emma had really died in that fire, why had someone left a photograph saying she survived? That night, I returned to the property alone. I didn't tell Lily, I didn't tell my mother, and I didn't tell Detective Mason, because by then, I wasn't sure who I could trust. I went back upstairs and entered the hidden room, even though it was completely empty. I stood there for several minutes, trying to remember everything that had been inside it before someone cleared it out. Then I remembered the old wooden chair. When the police had searched the room earlier, they had removed almost everything except the chair, because they considered it ordinary furniture. I turned it upside down and examined the underside carefully. There was a small metal plate attached to the wooden frame, secured by 4 tiny screws. I removed them, pulled the plate away, and found something hidden inside the hollow frame. It was a key. The key was old, made from brass, and attached to it was a small handwritten label that said basement. I stared at it for several seconds, because the house didn't have a basement. At least, according to the blueprint, it didn't. I went downstairs and entered the kitchen, then started examining the walls. Eventually, I moved the refrigerator, and noticed that one section of the wall didn't match the rest. I knocked on it with my knuckles, and heard a hollow sound. My hands started shaking as I removed the panel, and behind it was a staircase leading downward into darkness. I switched on my flashlight and slowly descended. The staircase was made from old concrete, and the air became colder with every step. At the bottom was another door, this one made from reinforced steel. Above the handle, someone had scratched a message directly into the metal. I moved my flashlight closer and read the words, "Daniel, if you found this, your father failed." I stepped closer, and then I noticed another line beneath it. But Emma didn't. I froze. My sister was alive, or at least, someone desperately wanted me to believe she was. I took the brass key from my pocket and placed it into the lock. For a moment, nothing happened. Then I turned it, and somewhere inside the door, a heavy mechanism released with a deep metallic click. I slowly pulled the door open, and a cold stream of air moved across my face. I raised my flashlight and looked into the darkness beyond it, but I couldn't see the end of the room. Then, from somewhere deep inside that darkness, a woman's voice quietly whispered my name. "Daniel." I stopped breathing. I recognized that voice. I had heard it once before, years ago. in an old home video from when I was a child. It was the voice of the sister I had been told was dead. Then the woman stepped forward, just far enough for the flashlight to catch part of her face, and she looked directly at me before saying, "You're finally home." I stood in the doorway, unable to move, staring at the woman who had just stepped into the light. She was older than the little girl in the photograph, but there was no doubt in my mind that she was Emma. The same green eyes, the same shape of her face, and even the small scar above her eyebrow matched the family photographs I had spent the afternoon studying. I wanted to ask 100 questions at once, but my mind couldn't organize any of them. Emma looked at me for several seconds before quietly saying, "You look exactly like him." I finally managed to ask, "My father?" She nodded and said, "He always said you'd come back eventually." I shook my head and told her, "I've never been here." She gave me a strange, almost sad smile, and replied, "Not physically." Emma walked deeper into the underground room and pointed toward a table. Dozens of photographs were scattered across it, and when I moved closer, I realized they weren't random photographs from the neighborhood. They were photographs of me, my childhood, my first day of school, my graduation, my wedding, my divorce, Lily being born, and moments from my life that I had never shared publicly. I picked up one of the photographs and stared at it in disbelief before asking, "Who took these?" Emma looked away and said, "Richard?" I immediately asked, "Richard? Vale?" She nodded and explained that he hadn't been watching me because he wanted to hurt me. He had been watching me because he was protecting me. I shook my head and asked, "Protecting me from what?" Emma didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked toward an old metal cabinet and opened it. Inside were hundreds of files, carefully organized and labeled. She pulled out one folder with my name written across the front and handed it to me. I opened it and found my birth certificate, school records, medical records, photographs, addresses, and documents from different stages of my life. Everything was there. Then I found another document beneath the records, and when I saw my father's signature at the bottom, I immediately recognized it. It was a legal agreement signed 25 years earlier. Emma explained that after the Briar Lane fire, my father had placed me into a private protection arrangement. It wasn't an official government program, but something he had created through people he trusted. He had discovered that the fire hadn't been an accident, and that someone had deliberately started it. The target hadn't been Emma, it had been my father. Emma survived because he had hidden her before the fire, but after the fire, he believed the people responsible would come back for both of us. So he separated us. Emma was sent to live under another identity, while I was raised believing I was an only child. My father spent the rest of his life collecting evidence, and Richard Vale had helped him. I looked at Emma and asked, "Then why did Richard die?" She stared at the floor for several seconds before quietly saying, "He didn't." My heart stopped. I asked her what she meant, and she explained that Richard had disappeared. His death certificate was fake, created because the people who were looking for them had finally discovered that he was protecting Emma. Suddenly, the black sedan, the hidden cameras, the photographs, and the anonymous messages all made sense. Someone wasn't trying to scare me away from the house. They were trying to find Emma, and they had used me to locate her. I looked back at the files and asked, "Why did they let me buy this house?" Emma's expression changed, and she said, "They didn't." I frowned and asked what she meant. She pointed toward the documents and explained that the house was never supposed to be sold to me. I immediately thought about the real estate agent and said, "The real estate agent." Emma nodded and finished the thought for me. She was working for them. The room seemed to spin as I realized the cheap price, the simple explanation about Richard's death, and the missing history had all been part of the same plan. They had deliberately lowered the price because they knew I would buy it. I asked why they wanted me there, and Emma took a deep breath before saying, "Because your father left something behind." I looked around the room and asked if she meant the photographs. She shook her head. I asked if it was the evidence, but again, she said no. I stared at her and asked, "Then what?" Emma walked toward the far wall and pressed her palm against a section of concrete. A hidden panel opened, revealing a small steel box. She removed it and placed it on the table. Inside was a single cassette tape and a handwritten note. I picked up the note, and the moment I saw the handwriting, I knew it was my father's. The note contained only one sentence. "If Daniel finds this, tell him the truth before they find Emma." My hands were shaking as I placed the cassette into an old player. Static filled the room, and then my father's voice came through the speaker. He sounded older than I remembered, tired and almost defeated, but there was no mistaking him. "Daniel," he said, and I closed my eyes. He continued, "If you're hearing this, I failed to protect you from the truth." I listened as he explained that he had spent years investigating the people responsible for the Briar Lane fire. They weren't after money, and they weren't after the property. They were trying to destroy evidence that connected several powerful people to a network of illegal property purchases made through false identities. My father's voice paused, and then he explained that Richard had discovered the same operation, which was why he had built the surveillance room. Richard wasn't spying on the neighborhood for himself. He had been documenting everyone connected to the operation. Then my father's voice became quieter. "Daniel, one of the people involved is someone you know." The recording stopped. I stared at the cassette player and asked, "That's it?" Emma shook her head and said, "There's another tape." She reached beneath the table and pulled out a second cassette. As she placed it into the player, I realized the first recording had only been the beginning. My father's voice returned, and this time he explained that only one person had been able to keep the operation alive for so long: the man who controlled the property records, the person who had access to every deed, every identity, and every investigation. I felt a chill before my father finally said the name: Richard Vale. I looked at Emma, but she immediately shook her head and said, "No." I stared at her and told her, "That can't be right." I looked at Emma, but she immediately shook her head and said, "No." I stared at her and told her, "That can't be right." I looked at Emma, but she immediately shook her head and said, "No." I stared at her and told her, "That can't be right." I looked at Emma, but she immediately shook her head and said, "No." I stared at her and told her, "That can't be right." I looked at Emma, but she immediately shook her head and said, "No." I stared at her and told her, "That can't be right." But eventually the people behind the operation would discover his betrayal. Then the recording ended. I sat there in silence, trying to understand what I had just heard. Richard hadn't been watching me because he wanted to find me. He had been watching the people who were watching me. The cameras weren't there to trap me. They were there to identify anyone who came near the house. The black sedan wasn't Richard's enemy. It belonged to the people searching for Emma. And the man inside the car hadn't been pointing at my house. He had been pointing at the hidden camera on the second floor. I turned toward Emma and asked, "Where is Richard now?" She hesitated before answering. "He's alive." I asked her where he was, but before she could respond, every light in the underground room suddenly went out. Complete darkness surrounded us, and a second later, we heard the heavy steel door lock behind us. Emma grabbed my arm and whispered, "They found us." Footsteps echoed from the other side of the door, one step, then another, slowly getting closer. Finally, a voice came through the steel. "Emma!" She froze. Then the voice continued, "Come outside. You don't need to hide anymore." I recognized the voice immediately. Detective Mason, the detective who had supposedly been helping me since the beginning. I leaned toward Emma and whispered, "He's one of them." She nodded and quietly replied, "He always was." The lock on the steel door began to turn, and we both knew we had only seconds left. Emma pointed toward a narrow opening behind the shelves and said, "Go." I looked at her and asked, "What about you?" She grabbed my arm and shouted, "Go." We ran into the darkness just as the steel door crashed open behind us. Someone shouted, "Find them," and footsteps rushed into the room. I grabbed Emma's hand and pulled her through the narrow tunnel as fast as we could. I didn't know where it led, I didn't know how far it went, and I didn't know who was waiting at the other end. But for the first time since I had bought the house, I knew exactly what we were running from. We ran into the darkness just as the steel door crashed open behind us, and I could hear several people entering the underground room. Emma pulled me forward through the narrow passage, while I tried to keep my flashlight pointed ahead without losing my balance. The tunnel was barely wide enough for one person, and the concrete walls were damp and cold against my shoulders. Behind us, someone shouted, "Find them," followed by the sound of footsteps entering the passage. I wanted to stop and ask Emma where we were going, but there was no time. She knew this tunnel, and that meant she had probably spent years preparing for the moment when she would have to use it. After several seconds, I finally asked, "Where does this go?" Emma kept running and answered, "Outside the property." I asked her how she knew, and she said, "Richard showed it to me years ago. I couldn't believe there was another hidden passage beneath the house, but by then, I had stopped being surprised by anything connected to Briar Lane." We continued forward, until the tunnel suddenly divided into two narrow corridors. Emma stopped for half a second, looked toward the left passage, and then pulled me in that direction. I asked why she had chosen that side, and she said, because the other one leads back to the surveillance room. Behind us, the footsteps were getting closer. We reached another steel door, and Emma struggled with the old latch before finally forcing it open. Cold night air rushed inside, and we climbed through a concealed opening beneath an abandoned structure that looked like an old storage building. I helped Emma out, then turned around and looked back toward the tunnel. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then a flashlight appeared in the darkness, followed by the shadow of someone moving toward us. Emma grabbed my arm and pulled me away from the entrance. We ran through the abandoned building until we reached a broken rear door, and when we stepped outside, I realized we weren't anywhere near my house. The building was surrounded by tall weeds, rusted equipment, and old wooden structures, and beyond them, I could see the lights of a road in the distance. Emma told me we were almost half a mile from Briar Lane. I asked how a tunnel that long could possibly exist beneath the neighborhood without anyone knowing about it, and she replied that the tunnels had been built decades earlier for a completely different purpose. Some of the properties on Briar Lane had once belonged to the same development company, and several underground service passages had been constructed beneath them. Over time, most of them had been sealed, but Richard had discovered the old network and secretly connected the passages to the house. Before I could ask another question, a flashlight appeared through the broken doorway behind us. Emma grabbed my hand again, but this time we didn't run immediately. Instead, she looked toward the road and whispered, "Someone is waiting for us." I followed her gaze and saw a dark vehicle parked beneath a streetlight. For a moment, I thought it was Detective Mason, but then the driver's door opened and an older man stepped out. Richard Vale. He was standing several yards away, holding a flashlight, and for the first time since I had seen him across the street, I could see his face clearly. He looked older than he had in the photographs, with silver-gray hair, deep-set eyes, and the exhausted expression of someone who had spent too many years carrying a secret alone. He looked at Emma first, then at me, and quietly said, "I'm sorry." I stared at him and asked, "For what?" Richard lowered the flashlight and said, "For making you believe your whole life was a lie." I told him that I didn't know what to believe anymore, and he answered, "Your life wasn't a lie. Your father made terrible choices, but he made them because he believed they were the only way to keep you alive." I asked him why he had watched me for so many years, and he explained that he hadn't been watching me to control my life. He had been watching the people who were watching me. Richard told me that after the fire, my father discovered that the people behind it had connections to a much larger operation involving abandoned properties, forged identities, fraudulent deeds, and hidden financial accounts. The fire had been designed to destroy documents that could expose the operation, but my father had managed to save some of the evidence before the building burned. Emma had survived because he had hidden her, and I had been separated from the family because he believed the people behind the operation would eventually search for both children. I asked Richard why my father had never told me the truth, and Richard looked away before saying, because he thought knowing the truth would make you a target. He explained that my father spent years collecting evidence while pretending to live an ordinary life. Richard helped him from inside the organization, and the surveillance room had been created as an archive where they could document everyone connected to the operation without drawing attention to themselves. Then I asked the question that had been bothering me since I first saw the hidden room. "If you were protecting us, why did you let me buy the house?" Richard didn't answer immediately. Emma looked at him, and I realized she already knew the answer. Finally, Richard said, "I didn't." I stared at him. He continued, "The people who were searching for Emma arranged the sale. They knew your name, they knew where you lived, and they knew your connection to your father. They believed you would eventually find something inside that house, so they wanted you there." I asked, "Then why didn't they simply take me?" Richard replied, "Because they needed you to lead them to Emma." The words hit me harder than anything else I had heard that night. I realized the house hadn't been sold to me because someone wanted to get rid of a property. It had been placed in my hands because I was being used as bait. Richard then told me something even worse. The real estate agent wasn't working alone. Someone inside law enforcement had been helping the organization for years. When I asked who, Richard looked directly at me and said, "Detective Mason." I felt my stomach drop. Richard explained that Mason had been assigned to cases connected to Briar Lane several times over the years. He had access to police records, property investigations, surveillance reports, and information about my family, When I reported the anonymous messages, he hadn't simply responded because he wanted to help me. He had responded because he needed to know exactly how much I had discovered. I looked toward the abandoned building behind us and asked, "Then why hasn't he followed us here?" Richard gave me a serious look and said, "Because he doesn't know I'm here yet." A second later, headlights appeared in the distance. Richard immediately turned toward the road. Now he does. We heard a vehicle approaching, and then another set of headlights appeared behind it. Richard told us to get into his car. Emma climbed into the back seat while I sat beside Richard, and the moment the engine started, he accelerated onto the road. Behind us, the approaching vehicles turned in the same direction. I looked through the rear window and saw the black sedan, the same car I had seen across from my house. Richard looked at me and said, "They're not going to stop until they get Emma." I asked him where we were going, and he replied, "Somewhere your father prepared for this exact situation." I wanted to ask what he meant, but then I noticed something on the dashboard. It was an old photograph of my father, Richard, and Emma standing together outside Briar Lane many years ago. On the back of the photograph was another handwritten message from my father. "If they find all three of you together, go to the warehouse." I looked at Richard. He nodded. "The warehouse is where your father's evidence is." And suddenly, I understood why he had been waiting for us there. The house wasn't the end of the secret. It was only the beginning. Richard drove through the darkness without saying much, while Emma sat silently in the back seat, and I kept watching the black sedan following us from a distance. Every few seconds, its headlights disappeared behind a curve or a line of trees, but then they would appear again, as if whoever was driving it wanted us to know they were still there. I asked Richard how long he had known that people were searching for Emma, and he said, "Long enough to understand that they'll never stop unless we expose everything they have been hiding." I asked him why my father had trusted him, and Richard looked at the photograph on the dashboard before saying, "Because your father knew I was willing to risk everything to protect your family." Then he turned onto an unmarked road and drove toward an old industrial district on the edge of the city. The warehouse was larger than I expected, an abandoned brick building surrounded by rusted fences and overgrown weeds. Richard stopped near a side entrance and told us to stay close. Inside, the building was almost completely dark, but he knew exactly where he was going. He led us through a series of empty rooms until we reached a locked metal door. He pulled a key from his coat, opened it, and switched on a single overhead light. What I saw inside made me realize that my father had spent far more time preparing for this than I had ever imagined. There were filing cabinets, boxes of documents, old computers, photographs, hard drives, property maps, and dozens of sealed envelopes arranged across several tables. I walked toward the nearest table and picked up one of the files. It contained records of properties that had been purchased, transferred, and sold under different names. Some of the properties had belonged to people who had died, while others had been abandoned after fires, bankruptcies, or foreclosures. The same names kept appearing across different documents, and I began to see the pattern. The people behind the operation weren't simply stealing houses. They were using false identities and forged documents to quietly take control of valuable properties, then moving the money through companies that existed only on paper. Emma stood beside me and said, "Your father discovered the network after he noticed something strange about the fire reports." I looked at her and asked what she meant, and she explained that the Briar Lane fire had been recorded as an accident, but several important property documents had disappeared from the county archive immediately afterward. My father started investigating, and what he found eventually connected the fire to a much larger operation. The people involved had been using abandoned properties as part of a long-running financial scheme, and anyone who discovered too much became a problem they needed to eliminate. I opened another file and found photographs of people meeting in parking lots, restaurants, offices, and private homes. Some of them were business owners, some were property managers, and some appeared to be government employees. Then I saw a photograph that made my hands go cold. Detective Mason was standing beside the real estate agent who had sold me the house. They were shaking hands outside a building I didn't recognize. The photograph had been taken years earlier. I turned toward Richard and asked, "How long has Mason been involved?" Richard answered, "Long enough that your father stopped trusting the police." I asked why nobody had exposed him before, and Richard explained that Mason had spent years making sure investigations disappeared before they became serious. He had access to reports, evidence, witness statements, and property records, and whenever someone got close to the truth, he knew before they did. That was why my father had built his own archive, and why Richard had continued collecting evidence outside official channels. Then I found a folder with my name on it. Inside was a photograph of me as a child standing beside my father. Behind the photograph was a handwritten note. Daniel must never know until Emma is safe. I looked at Emma and asked, why did he keep this from me for so long? Emma lowered her eyes and said, because he knew that if you knew I was alive, you would come looking for me. I asked her why she had never contacted me, and she explained that she had wanted to more times than I could count, but Richard had always warned her that contacting me would put both of us in danger. She had spent years living under another name, watching my life from a distance, knowing things about me that I had never realized anyone outside my family knew. I felt angry, not only at my father, but at everyone who had decided what I was allowed to know. I told Emma that they had stolen years from us, and she quietly replied, I know. Then she looked at me and said something I wasn't expecting. But your father wasn't trying to take me away from you forever. He was trying to make sure there was still a chance for us to meet. Before I could answer, we heard a loud metallic sound somewhere outside the warehouse. Richard immediately turned off the light. Everyone went silent. A vehicle door slammed, then another. I looked toward the windows and saw faint beams of light moving across the warehouse walls. Richard whispered, they're here. Emma grabbed my hand, and Richard moved toward another table where several sealed envelopes were stacked. He picked up one of them and handed it to me. This is what they are really afraid of. I asked what was inside, but Richard told me to open it only when we were somewhere safe. Then he pulled out a small hard drive and said, your father copied everything onto this. Another sound came from outside. This time it was closer. Someone shouted, Richard! Richard looked at us and said, we don't have much time. The warehouse door suddenly opened, and several men entered with flashlights. Richard pushed us toward a back corridor while he stayed behind long enough to slow them down. Emma and I ran through the darkness until we reached another exit, but before we could get outside, a man stepped into the doorway. It was Detective Mason. He looked directly at me and said, Daniel, you have no idea what you've gotten yourself into. I stood there, staring at the man I had trusted. Then I looked at the hard drive in my hand. For the first time, I understood that the person chasing us wasn't trying to hide the truth anymore. He was trying to destroy it. I stood in the warehouse doorway, staring at Detective Mason, unable to believe that the man who had supposedly been helping me from the beginning was now standing in front of me as the person trying to destroy the evidence. He looked completely different from the detective I had met at the house. There was no concern in his expression now, no attempt to pretend he was protecting me. He simply looked at the hard drive in my hand and said, Daniel, you have no idea what you've gotten yourself into. I tightened my grip around it and replied, I know enough to understand that you lied to me. Mason took a step forward and said, your father lied to you first. Before he could move any closer, Richard appeared behind him and shouted, don't touch him. Mason turned around, and for the first time, I saw fear cross his face. Richard had managed to get around the other men and was standing in the corridor with a flashlight in one hand and a phone in the other. He told Mason that the entire warehouse had already been connected to an external server and that everything stored inside had been copied. Mason stared at him and asked, you think that changes anything? Richard answered, it changes everything, because now the evidence doesn't disappear if you destroy this place. Mason looked at me and then at Emma, realizing that whatever control he thought he had was beginning to slip away. Then the sound of sirens filled the distance, and several vehicles stopped outside the warehouse. Richard had already contacted state investigators before we arrived, and this time, Mason had nowhere left to run. The investigation that followed uncovered far more than any of us expected. The people behind the operation had spent more than 25 years using false identities, forged property records, shell companies, and corrupt connections to acquire valuable properties after fires, bankruptcies, and unexplained deaths. The Briar Lane fire had been one of the events they used to erase evidence, but my father had managed to preserve enough documents to expose the pattern. Richard had secretly collected the rest, while the surveillance room inside the house had been used as an archive to document everyone connected to the operation. The photographs weren't there because Richard enjoyed spying on people. They were evidence, and every photograph had a reason for being there. Detective Mason was arrested that night, and the real estate agent who had sold me the house was arrested 2 days later. Investigators also uncovered financial records connecting several other people to the operation, and suddenly the strange things that had happened around my family for decades began making sense. My father's paranoia hadn't been imaginary. The fire hadn't been an accident. Emma hadn't died. Richard hadn't really died either. And the house I had believed I bought by chance had been placed in my hands because someone thought I could be used to find the sister I never knew was alive. Months later, the entire network began collapsing. Richard testified about his years working from inside the organization. Emma testified about the life she had been forced to live under another identity. And eventually I testified too. I told them everything I knew, from the moment the real estate agent gave me the suspiciously low price, to the moment I discovered the hidden room, the photographs, the secret passage, and the underground archive. For the first time, I understood why my father had spent his entire life protecting us, even though I still wished he had trusted me enough to tell me the truth. The government seized the Briar Lane property while the investigation continued, and months later I returned to the house for the final time. The hidden door upstairs had been removed, the walls had been repaired, and the surveillance room that had once been filled with photographs and secrets was completely empty. I walked slowly through the hallway and stopped where the hidden entrance had once been. For the first time since I had bought the property, the house didn't feel threatening. It simply felt like an old house again. Emma stood beside me and asked, "You still want to sell it?" I looked toward the backyard and smiled before answering, "No." She looked surprised and asked why, and I told her that despite everything that had happened there, it was also the place where I had finally discovered who my family really was. I had bought the house believing I was starting a new life, but instead I had walked directly into the life my father had spent decades trying to protect me from. Lily came running through the backyard a moment later, and when she reached us, Emma smiled and opened her arms. Watching my daughter hug the sister I had spent my entire life believing was dead was the moment everything finally became real. The secrets, the lies, the fear, the hidden rooms, and the years we had lost were still part of our history, but they no longer controlled us. My father had spent decades trying to make sure we survived. Richard had risked his life to protect us, and Emma had lived an entire lifetime waiting for the day she could finally stand beside her brother without hiding. I had once believed the house was haunted because of the man who supposedly died there. I was wrong. The house hadn't been haunted. It had been watching, waiting, recording, and protecting a secret until someone finally came looking for it, and that someone was me. Sometimes the darkest secrets aren't buried because people want them forgotten. They're buried because someone is waiting for the right person to uncover them. And sometimes, the house you thought you bought by accident isn't really waiting for a buyer at all. It's waiting for the person who is finally ready to discover the truth.